Good evening, everyone. Welcome to GMA Live. This is the latest in our series of webinars, and tonight's is the first that's brought to you in association with one of our corporate members, SIS Pitches. And the topic tonight is artificial pitch maintenance essentials. So we'll be covering a number of key issues affecting both the volunteer and professional grounds manager, and with the opportunity for advice and insight for some leading experts in the field. Before we do any sort of formal introductions, I'm going to hand over to Luke from SIS Pitches, who's just going to give us a quick overview of the company. So over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Tom, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Just about SIS Pitches, we're a global pitch specialist, and we design, manufacture, install, construct and maintain all kinds of pitches across the world, from synthetic, natural and hybrid. We've got over 300 employees globally now, and we work with some of the biggest names in sport, as you can see on the slide: FC Barcelona, Chelsea, Loughborough University, as well as Saracens, who are represented tonight by Richard. So Richard, thanks for joining. And in terms of SIS Plus, that's our in-house specialist maintenance division, which I also look after as part of my role here at SIS.
Great, thanks, Luke. So just some housekeeping before we get into the main body of the webinar. So all your mics and cameras will be automatically turned off, so you don't need to worry about any background noise. That's only me that has to worry about that, with my little boys running around upstairs. If you've got any questions, then you can use the panel bar to the right-hand side of your screen. These are only visible to myself and the guys working in the back. And I know some of you have already pre-registered questions, so we will do our best to answer a few of those at the end of the webinar. As with previous webinars, any questions that we haven't got around to answering, we'll make sure we get back to you individually afterwards. And the webinar will be recorded and is usually available from the following day. So again, you don't need to worry too much about taking notes. What we like to do with the live webinars is run 2 or 3 live interactive polls just to get a bit of insight into who's in the audience. So the first one should appear on your screen shortly. And as you can see there, so which best describes you? And if you could please all select the appropriate answer there. I'll just give you a few more seconds for that. Great, thanks. Could we have the results, please? Okay, so quite heavily weighted towards the professional sector, which is interesting. Okay, thank you everyone for that. And so moving on to the panel. So I'm the host this evening. My name's Tom Rowley, and I joined the GMA in 2014 as a regional pitch advisor. I'm now the key account manager for football, so I work closely with the FA and the Football Foundation on their grass pitch strategies. Prior to joining the GMA, I was on the ground staff at Leicester City Football Club. So also joining us on the panel this evening, we have Dr. Catherine Seven of the Football Foundation. So Catherine, if you could please give us an introduction to yourself.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Catherine. I'm the AGP Framework and Procurement Manager at the Football Foundation. So I've been with the Football Foundation for just over a year now. It kind of coincided with the start of the current iteration of the framework, which runs for 4 years. Prior to that, I was the technical director at Labo Sport, which is one of the test houses, which some of you may be familiar with, that go around testing sports surfaces. And prior to that, I guess my experience really started kind of back in academia. So for my sins, I did do a PhD in 3G pitches for all those that might be interested.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And we're also joined by Richard Gregg from Saracens Limited. Richard.
Evening, everybody. I am Operations Director for Saracens. I look after the day-to-day operations of the business off the pitch, so to speak. I know we're going to talk about on the pitch in a sec, but I don't look after the players. I look after the staff and infrastructure around it. And I'm a bit of a generalist, but the main bulk of my time is focusing on facility management and people logistics, as well as our grounds that incorporates the pitch.
Thanks, Richard. And then finally, we have Luke Edwards from SIS Pitches.
Yeah, hi. As I mentioned, I'm the Technical and Maintenance Director at SIS Pitches. I've been in the industry for over 15 years now, and my background was in sports and material science. As part of my current role at SIS, I look after SIS Plus, which is a specialist in-house maintenance division. We maintain a variety of services across the country and work with a large number of different clients every single day.
Great, thanks all. As you can see, we've got a wealth of experience on the panel this evening. So what we're going to be talking about this evening, we're going to be looking at the importance of maintenance of your artificial surfaces, how maintenance can help the longevity of your pitch, safety for your pitch users, warranties and performance standards, independent testing, internal versus specialised contractors, and then looking at some of the different types of surfaces. So we're going to run another quick poll now, please, if we could have that up on the screen. So the question is, how do you conduct your maintenance currently? So please select from the following options: in-house team, external company, both, or none at all. And again, we'll just leave that up for a few more seconds. Okay, could I have the results up, please? Okay, so a mixture of both seems to be the most popular there, and quite a few also doing it themselves in-house. So thanks again, everyone, for answering the poll. Okie doke. So let's look at the different types of artificial surfaces. So starting with Luke, could you just talk us through the different types of artificial surfaces there are, please?
Sure. I think there's quite a variety to choose from. The most common, I would say, that we come across currently would be long pile, or so-called 3G or third generation surfaces. As I say, these are long pile, typically filled with sand and some kind of performance infill, which would usually be something like rubber crumb. They may or may not have a shock pad, and these types of surfaces are most typically used for things like football, rugby and other contact sports. Moving on, you'd have what we would deem in the industry as second generation or 2G. These are shorter, denser, either sand filled or sand dressed surfaces. You use them for things like hockey, maybe tennis, maybe multi-use games areas or muggers. And these may or may not have a shock pad, it just depends. More commonly, you would say that they would have. Water-based pitches or fully synthetic are specialist hockey pitches. These have an irrigation system, and they basically pour a load of water onto the surface prior to use. It's something that the FIH are looking to move away from in the coming years, because environmentally it's probably not the greatest thing to be doing. Running tracks, jumps areas, polymerics, these are fairly self-explanatory. Hard surfaces for athletics and the like. And then finally, courts, of which you could have a variety: tennis, netball, and different kinds of surface, maybe hard courts, asphalt, macadam, or even synthetic. So quite a wide-ranging spectrum there.
Great, thanks, Luke. So Catherine, moving on to the importance of maintenance. So it seems that there's a perception with artificial surfaces, certainly in the wider public outside of the grounds industry, that they are hassle-free essentially. So you would just install your product and away you go, it looks after itself. Is that correct?
No, definitely not. Like anything in life, you know, if you want something to last and, you know, perform as you would when you buy anything, you know, on day one, you've got to look after it, and maintenance of any type of surface is therefore key. You know, it's important that any pitch or court or athletic track is maintained throughout its service life. You know, you need to maximise and meet its expected lifespan. They're, you know, particularly expensive things to install. You know, we could be looking upwards of £500,000 for, you know, a full-size football pitch. So they're big investments, and you want to be able to maximise the life out of it by looking after it correctly. Every surface and pitch will degrade with age and with use, and the majority of pitches as well are outside. They're open to the elements as well. Any surface, any court, any pitch, should have a maintenance schedule in line with what is recommended by the manufacturer or surface provider, and also the programme of use. And in particular, the programme of use that can change over the years, so it should really be reviewed regularly, and any maintenance should be adapted to suit that.
Great. And so is there different types of maintenance for the different surfaces?
Yes, so you probably could categorise maintenance generally probably into 3 areas. So you have your regular and routine activities. You then might have more specialist maintenance that you carry out periodically, and then you've potentially then got major maintenance works, and that would probably go for any surface, but in terms of exactly what maintenance is required will differ depending on the surface. So a lot of the regular and routine activities, that could be true of all facilities. It'd be things like general housekeeping, litter picking, removing debris off the surface, checking the condition of your sports equipment, any drainage filters and inspection chambers. Surfaces such as artificial turf, where you've got fibres and you've got infill material, there will be a need to brush those surfaces. You might need to top up localised high usage areas, for example, and these are often things that you could do in-house. Your more specialist maintenance is more periodic, so vegetation treatments, that was probably applicable to all surfaces. Synthetic turf and those that have infill material, you'll need to look at decompacting the infill and topping up across the pitch. If you're looking at an athletics track or a polymeric surface, it might be pressure washing and cleaning that surface to make sure that you're removing the debris and any buildup of moss and algae, for example. This often requires a bit more specialist maintenance, which some people may have the ability to do in-house, but often people will access this through a maintenance specialist company through a contract. And then I guess the major works, is where maintenance hasn't been done, where pitches and surfaces have been neglected and become heavily contaminated. And this can include things such as seams and joint repairs. When you're looking at artificial turf, it could be full removal and cleaning and replacement of infill material on things such as 3G pitches or sand dress pitches. And when you're looking at things like courts, for example, it could be, recoating of tennis courts where those are painted, for example. So there's lots of similarities, but then each surface will have its own specialist, maintenance requirements as well.
That's great. And Luke, can you elaborate on any of the different types of maintenance in particular? For instance, some light brushing. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on how and when and the best times to do it, and what equipment, and whether this should be in-house or a contractor?
Yeah, so things like light brushing is generally what we class as routine maintenance, and this would be carried out in-house ideally if you've got the personnel and the right equipment with the right training. This is usually linked to hours of usage, and we would say as a turf manufacturer, for every 30 to 40 hours of use, you should be brushing that pitch, at least once per week. Obviously, if the usage increases, so you double it, then the frequency of brushing should be doubling as well. So, potentially moving up to twice a week. In terms of things like more specialised maintenance, deep cleans, decompactions, things like that, that can, of course, be carried out, by an in-house team, again, if you have the right equipment and personnel. But in our experience, we find that a lot of field operators and owners don't have that equipment to hand, so they prefer to outsource it. And that would then typically be carried out, maybe on a quarterly basis, perhaps bi-monthly, always linked to the usage of the field. So obviously more usage should be requiring more maintenance. It's down to the field owner ultimately on how they want to do it, but as I say, as a turf manufacturer, we do link the regular maintenance, both specialised and the routine maintenance, to the warranty document.
Great, thanks, Luke. And finally, Richard, just picking up on some of the points that Catherine and Luke have made there. So maintenance isn't just confined to the playing surface. What measures do you take to prevent migration of infill away from the playing surface?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'll explain our venue in a bit more detail shortly, but we're a multi-use venue with a running track around the outside, and rubber crumb and running tracks are not the greatest combination. So that there's regular kind of, we'll blow the rubber back onto the pitch, tidy up the track. So we have to look after all our stakeholders, both on the pitch and using the surrounding areas. There's ways to contain it. We've obviously got perimeter boards, but we're an open bowl, which you'll see on the photo shortly.
Great, thank you. So before we move on to the next section, we've got the last interactive poll. So if we could have that up on the screen, please. So the question is, which type of surface or surfaces do you manage at your facility? The options are 3G, synthetic, natural stroke hybrid, running tracks or polymeric surfaces, courts and hard surfaces, or multiple facilities or other. And once again, we will leave that on the screen for a few seconds for you to select the appropriate answer. Okay, thanks. Could we have the results, please? Okay, so generally multiple facilities and also quite a lot of 3G and synthetics and also natural as well. Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to, skipped on the slide there, just go back. So Richard's going to talk us through his scenario in managing the surfaces at Saracens. So hand over to you now, Richard.
Thanks, Tom. I briefly just wanted to give a bit of background to our venue. We were built in 2013, so 8 years ago, and we were built as a community use stadium, and by that we had various stakeholders that had an interest in the site, namely Shaftesbury Barnet Harriers, who are an athletics club, one of the best in the country, and we needed to disrupt the way that they operated in order to build a rugby pitch. Now, within that agreement, under our planning conditions and our section 106, we agreed to put artificial pitch in, which allowed for various use. So in terms of our key stakeholders are obviously Saracens within the stadium as a rugby club who play currently in the Championship, but are previously European champions and a part of the Premiership. So we have that side of things to look after from elite performance level on the surface, but also we have an obligation to our community. Those of you who know Saracens, we have a big charitable arm through our sports foundation, which has huge social impact across our local community and the wider community, further reaching out towards Hertfordshire, Kent, Essex, etc. But back to the stadium, we've got the running track around the outside that I touched on previously, and we need to make sure that that's usable, the pitch is usable, and it's done to a high standard. But we use the pitch for other things. NFL teams often play at Wembley, which is a stone's throw from our stadium. They use our site as their training venue. And back in 2013, when we first started with the pitch, we had a product called SIS Rugger 365. We had that for around 3 seasons. And when we were built and it was a new community hub, we absolutely hammered the pitch. And that was by design. We wanted to sweat the asset like any other business would, but we also offered the pitch. We'd open it up at the end of games, fans could come on. We're a 10,000 seater capacity. So even if you put half of that across the pitch in day-to-day shoes, you're not asking for trouble, but you're certainly reacting to a need, and the program does impact the volume of maintenance that we're putting into the product. So after 3 years, Luke kindly explained to me at the time that if our fibres were a piece of paper and people keep standing on them, they're going to flatten, and if it's a piece of paper and it becomes a crease, once that crease is in, it's almost impossible to get it back out. Now, obviously, we do decompaction, we brush the pitch to try and make sure that it does come back up. But the more use it gets, the harder it was to maintain. And we made a decision in 2016 when SIS released their latest product that we needed to put the best surface in for Saracens to play on, but we also needed to invest a bit more into our maintenance of that product. And to do that, that was the SIS Grand Slam came in, more fibres, per square metre than any other pitch on the market. The fibres help support and reduce the level of flattening we were experiencing. And to date, it's standing up and still in excellent condition. So we're 5 seasons in. Obviously, it's had a bit of less use over the last year, and our maintenance has adjusted to that need. But we're gearing back up and slowly coming back to life, and it will be busy again. They're the kind of challenges we've been dealing with over time, that we want to get a balance between an elite playing surface and a community use site, and we're quite unique in that way, that there aren't too many other clubs around that are in a similar situation. Newcastle have an artificial, Cardiff Blues have an artificial, Worcester have one, but we've got the best that's available, and to date, very, very happy with the performance. So there's some of the learnings that were spoken about there, and I know Catherine touched on our approach to how we maintain it, and everyone's been asked on the poll already, and I think it was 57% said they're using both in-house and contractors to do their maintenance, and that's exactly how we do it. So we've got an in-house team that looks after our grounds, and that includes the pitch. And then when we know we've got an elite game, and by that I mean a men's game, a women's fixture, we will work with SIS to come in the day before, and they'll do a full inspection and address the points that Catherine brought up, whether or not it's around checking the seams, the decompaction, the infill levels. They'll do everything for us, and that's a regular check for us, and it's probably bi-weekly. I'm not saying you'll need to do it bi-weekly on every pitch, but to make sure that we're performing, and by performing I mean on the pitch, but I also mean by performing by our staff and making sure that they've got that pitch ready in its best possible way, and SIS can do that better than anybody.
Thanks, Richard. So obviously lots of lessons learnt there. Luke, you've obviously been involved there with Richard. You got anything to add to Richard's comments?
Yeah, I think it's a good example really of the pitch was being heavily used, and we tried our best to work with Richard and the team at Saracens as a partner in order to put something in place, both from a turf system, that's the shock pad, the turf and the infill, as well as the maintenance package that runs alongside that. So we're there to support Richard and the teams that are playing on that facility to ensure that it's in its optimal condition every single day.
Great, thank you very much. So now we are going to talk a little bit more around performance standards and testing. So coming to you now, Catherine. So why should we get artificial surfaces tested? And is this something we have to do, or is it just something we should do?
Yeah, so I think testing your surfaces regularly ensures that they're of the required quality, that the surface has been installed correctly, and that essentially that they're providing a safe and satisfactory playing environment throughout the surface life. Most sports request a surface to be tested to satisfy particular competition and league rules, and this becomes more prevalent the higher up the level of play becomes, but there is the ability to test a pitch at all levels. So what we do know is most sports and their governing bodies have their own tests and test requirements, but we also have the British and European standards, which also essentially sets a benchmark and something that we should all be working to as a minimum. So I mean, if I move on, we can look generally at what kind of testing processes cover. So if somebody is coming to test your sports pitch or your court, one of the main things they'll look at is the player surface interactions, and this is very much, I guess, health and safety related. So they may look at how hard or how soft the surface is. Does it deform when a heavy weight is dropped on it? When it comes to rugby, we have a test that looks at something called the head impact criteria. Obviously, we've got people potentially falling to the ground from quite high level and quite large forces, so that's particularly important there. Where a ball is part of the sport, you will also test the ball surface interactions, so that might be the ball bounce, the ball roll, the angle of ball rebound. then we will look generally at the construction requirements. So you might look at surface deviations or the dimensions of a surface. You know, some sports require minimum and maximum dimensions in order to pass for their certification processes. Athletics is particularly key when it comes to dimensions. If you're wanting to host certain level of competitions where records may be broken. If you've got a surface that contains infill material, you'll often find that infill levels are measured, and if it's a surface where it's an artificial turf, for example, they'll also measure what's something that's called the free pile height. Hard polymeric surfaces, you'll probably look more at the thickness and the depth of that layer of polymeric surfacing. Another key thing is visual defects. So, you know, performance requirements may pass, but if you have things such as tough loss, or you've got open and torn seams, you have line markings that are not straight, you might have a polymeric surface where the polymeric itself is delaminated from the tarmac underneath. All of these things are often picked up because actually these can provide health and safety issues. The last thing you want is somebody, you know, getting their foot stuck under an open seam and falling over and injuring themselves. And then lastly, something that people often forget about are the other ancillary items. So yes, test houses will go in and test the surface to see whether it complies for the relevant sport, but also they should be looking at other things that are surrounding it. So goals, sports equipment, fencing, general housekeeping. You know, if those things are not of the required condition, again, you know, they can pose health and safety risks as well. So all these things are noted and will be reported as part of that process. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, testing requirements are often dependent on the level of play. So I'll just run through a couple of examples from some of the main sports. So in England, for example, there's the FA register. So any 3G pitch that is used for FA affiliated football must be on the register. If a match is played on a pitch that is not on the register, then essentially you're at risk of that league or competition imposing sanctions. Training can take place on a pitch that isn't on the register, but again, it's always recommended that you then carry out your own risk assessments to make sure that the pitch is safe to use. The FA register also requires different level of certification depending on where the matches that are played on kind of sit within the National League system or whether they're at community level. So any match that is played in steps 1 to 6 of the National League system must be tested and certified to the FIFA quality programme, for example, whereas pitches that are used for competitions at step 7 and below at the more community level are required as a minimum to have an FA register test. If they have a FIFA test and it's certified, then that's fine, it automatically is added to the register, but there is an alternative option there. So if we just look at FIFA, FIFA have a quality programme for football turf, and essentially it sets out internationally recognised industry standards. So only artificial turf surfaces that have been tested both in the laboratory and then in the field according to the test criteria of FIFA can be certified. Now FIFA awards the FIFA quality mark, and that's generally to pitches very much focused at community level, amateur, where you get a very high intensity of usage. And then there's also the FIFA quality pro mark, and that is very much focused at the highest level of performance and professional level football. You know, hours of usage is probably limited to those pitches. So if we move on to hockey, the FIH, the International Federation for Hockey, their criteria is generally a combination of the surface type and therefore what level of play you can then play on that particular surface. So they have 4 categories. So they have the multi-sport, which is lots of different types of surfaces that you can actually play more than just hockey on. Very much community development level hockey is the focus there. So what you might find is that these might be surfaces that you might play football on as well, for example, maybe at a school level. You've got the national category. These are generally normally your sand dressed or sandfill surfaces, where hockey is the primary sport. And these pitches, they can be used at, lower level national, regional and club play. So we see a lot of sand dressed hockey pitches in the UK, for example. And then, as Luke said, you've then got the global level, which is the non-fill surface or the water-based surfaces that are generally used at the top level, national competitions and international. The fourth category is called global elite, and that is very much the FIH, world level international competitions, where they've got everything connected to things such as grandstands and things like that. So that's kind of how they determine the requirements. World Rugby, slightly different in terms that they have one standard that covers any pitch, no matter what size that pitch is. World Rugby is very much focused on the safety aspect. The difference here is you will have your pitch tested, and then depending on the dimensions, the overall size, they will then stipulate whether you can play full level games, international games, or whether it can just be used for contact training. So it's one size fits all, and then they will basically look at the laws of the game and then determine whether you can use it for training or competition level, and then what level that competition is. And it's generally dimensions that restrict the decision around that. And the English RFU, in particular, they use the World Rugby Regulation 22 requirement as part of their insurance cover. So any rugby pitch, anyone wanting to play contact rugby in England really needs to have their pitch tested to World Rugby Regulation 22. If you don't and something happens, the RFU aren't really in a position to kind of support and help from an insurance point of view. So we just move on to athletics, so more the polymeric surfaces. So in the UK, athletics introduced something called the track mark scheme back in 2018. This is very much a quality assurance scheme. They're looking at the condition of tracks and any other ancillary items such as cages and jump beds. The focus really is on health and safety, and are these facilities fit for purpose? In addition to that, if you are using tracks and facilities at high level of competitions, there is a requirement to comply with various UKA and IAAF rule books, but I won't bore you with that this evening. And then, you can carry on. Tennis have sets of requirements, netball do, and as I mentioned, the backstop is always the British and European standard, and where you've got multi-sports pitches very much at community level and in schools, the British and European standard is often the benchmark, and where we'd probably say to kind of, if you're looking to construct a pitch and build a pitch, they're the requirements that you should be looking to try and achieve as a minimum. And then obviously as your level of competition increases, you might then need to start essentially, check with the governing bodies, find out what level of play is going to be used for that surface, and then you can ensure that you're installing the correct type of surface or surface system to achieve that moving forward.
Fantastic, thanks Catherine, that's very comprehensive. Just Luke, so obviously Catherine's gone into quite a lot of detail there, which is really interesting. So where can people go then to get their services tested and accredited, and how often do they need to do this?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to follow that, Catherine, thanks. Yeah, I think there's a number of variables that you need to consider. So it depends on the sport, as Catherine said. It depends on the surface type, the level of play or competition, or even the funder in certain instances in terms of how often you need to get your facility tested. I'd say on average, a good average is every 1 to 3 years. So to give some examples, FIFA Quality Pro, which is usually a stadia facility, would be annually. FIFA Quality, which is more community-based, would be every 3 years. There are some old, I think, FIFA 2-star facilities that are every 4 years, but they are generally being phased out now. World Rugby is every 2 years, and that's really driven by safety, particularly for head injuries, as again Catherine pointed out. which is pretty important. If you're a large rugby player falling from height, you've got to make sure that that surface is going to be safe. In terms of where you go, there are a number of known test houses who specialise in testing of surfaces, and they are basically travelling all over the world, testing football, rugby, athletics, any kind of surface basically, and they will test to the relevant governing body standard that exists. From a maintenance provider point of view, I'd say that we see fields that deteriorate quite quickly if they're not maintained. So our view is very much that testing and maintenance should be going hand in hand, and that you can actually use testing as a tool and to help track your performance over a period of time. Hopefully you don't flag anything serious, but there are times where a testing program will flag maybe one or two minor health and safety issues that can be easily fixed if you jump on them quickly.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that was going to be my next comment, was around, obviously Richard mentioned that he has you guys in regularly before matches to test. How important is that for people who might be on the call to do their own monitoring in-house? And what sort of things can they do in-house? What sort of tests can they do potentially with limited equipment to do that?
Yeah, I think a very simple one is just visual inspection. Looking at the seams, looking at your equipment, the goals, the nets, obviously floodlighting as well, if that's applicable. That's something that everyone can do quite easily. You just follow a simple checklist. Other things would be, you walk the fields and check for debris. Is there anything on there that shouldn't be? Glass, stones, and if there is, you need to remove that as quickly as possible, certainly before usage. So yeah, there are some basic things that that can be done and should be done, and would typically form part of your routine maintenance program.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else anything to add before we move on? Okay. So my slides are going very slowly. There we go. So this is a question really to everybody on the panel. So what are the exciting or new developments that are on the horizon for grounds management regarding artificial maintenance? And are there any new technologies coming soon that we should be aware of? So to Luke first.
Okay, well, I think one area that sort of jumps to mind would be, obviously there's ongoing concerns regarding microplastic infills, particularly in third generation long pile surfaces. And as a result of that, we're starting to see sort of newer alternative infills, performance infills being used, particularly ones that are made using natural materials, whether that's things like cork, coconut, etc. My view, and I think this has probably been proven over a period of time, is that these newer infills, behave very differently to the so-called traditional infills, such as rubber crumb. And as a result of that, we think that maintenance practices will need to be adapted accordingly. They'll need to evolve. What do I mean by that? So, as an example, rubber crumb is a very resilient, very hard-wearing material. And it's very, very durable. It's designed to be on a car tire ultimately and last for a long time. So it won't break down, and it won't readily compact. Some of these other materials will break down just by nature. They're organic. That's what they're designed to do. And so, maintenance will need to be increased. The frequency will need to be increased. The practices will need to change. Things like infill top-ups, whether that's a local infill top-up, penalty spots or corner flags, high wear areas will need to be, increased. Maybe whole field infill top-ups will need to increase as well. So there are certain things that you're going to see coming, I think, down the road, and people will need to start modifying, certainly in our opinion, their maintenance practices accordingly.
Okay, thanks. Richard, Catherine, anything to add?
I think just to piggyback what Luke's talking about infill there, we have a challenge, and I would have mentioned it previously, but I wanted to bring it up now, is more around our rugby season, and the global rugby calendar has got longer. You'll see that the fixtures that used to end in May, where the Prem final used to take place last weekend in May, is now moving towards sort of mid-end of June. With that comes increases in temperature, and where our pitch is subject to temperatures in excess of sort of 23, 24 degrees, you'll start to see that the players fatigue a bit more because the temperature of the surface is a lot higher, and that's something that we would look for solutions and maybe alternative answers. I'm not saying you cannot play on a rubber crumb pitch under that temperature, but if an infill is available that reduces that temperature and facilitates less exhaustion, again, that's radical, but the best surface we need to present to our players, we would look to explore that development.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Luke, Catherine, anything to add on the back of Richard's comments?
Probably just going back really actually to Luke's comment around microplastics and just generally, I guess, how the world is changing. You know, legislation is changing, people are becoming much more aware of the environment around them, and actually, you know, it's how do we adapt our maintenance practices with the pitches we currently have to how do we keep infill in our pitches. And you know, it is maybe looking to adapt maintenance processes. So how do we brush our pitches? Do we start in the middle and go out when we should maybe start from the outside and work our way in? You know, where do we clean our maintenance equipment? Is it on the pitch or is it outside of the pitch where rubber crumb might then be able to get into drainage courses? So it's small changes as well as big changes in terms of, you know, how we are going to have to change and develop in terms of maintenance. And I think probably just a bit as an aside as well, I think people are becoming much more aware how important maintenance is with sports facilities, and what can we do to kind of help groundsmen and operators, the facility operators, in terms of managing that. And there are lots of new systems and existing systems out there that people can utilise and adapt. Lots of the specialist maintenance companies already use them themselves, but you know, looking at how do you manage, how do you plan, how do you anticipate and predict when you might need to do certain maintenance aspects. So looking at some of these maintenance monitoring systems is potentially something that I think we'll also see a lot more of in the future.
Great, thank you. And Luke, anything to add?
Well, just on microplastics and retention, really. So just to piggyback on what Catherine is saying is, you know, yes, I think maintenance practices are definitely going to have to change, you know, and that will be, you know, things like cleaning and just general processes. But beyond that, I think, you know, we're also going to see design criteria, you know, that's going to dictate, you know, how fields are built in the future and how you use, you know, physical barriers or catch pits or filters within the design of the actual field construction itself to help retain any infill within that, you know, playing surface. And so that's going to become more and more important as we move forwards.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. So we'll move on to questions now. So we've had a couple of questions come in during the course of the evening, and so we'll go with the first one we've got is, how many times per year should you deep clean your pitch? And do you think it's worthwhile buying a deep clean attachment for our tractor so we can do this in-house?
I think again, I think it depends on usage, but as a rule, we would say an annual deep clean would be sufficient for a reasonably well used pitch. As to whether it makes sense to buy, I guess there's a couple of questions that you need to answer. One is, you know, what is the payback on that? You know, these bits of kit are pretty expensive. So that's the first question you need to be asking. And then the second question is, do you have, you know, the personnel and infrastructure to be able to deliver that? You know, so in our experience, I would say most people, you know, wouldn't, you know, buy that kit themselves. They would outsource that because the payback is probably going to be, you know, over sort of 7-8 years, I would say. So it doesn't really make financial sense to do that. But again, okay, yeah, if you've got the funds, then, you know, you can do it in-house.
Great, cheers. And then another question we've had in is, what is best practice to produce a maintenance program on a 3G football pitch?
Again, I think it's really a combination of disciplined routine maintenance, which would ideally be done in-house. So with your in-house personnel and with your own equipment, that would be simple things like brushing the facility, localized infill top-ups, litter collections, debris collections, inspections, and so on. And then in combination with that, you'd be looking at a more specialized maintenance program. So that's probably going to be, again, on average, 4 to 6 visits per year by a contractor, and they will come in, they'll decompact the pitch, they'll do a much more aggressive brush, they'll redistribute infill, plus any other sort of jobs such as weed killing around the perimeter.
Great, cheers. Catherine, Richard, anything to add on either of those questions?
Just, I guess, picking up on the maintenance program, when you're first handed a new facility, you will have O&M manuals. Within that, there will be recommendations from the manufacturer. There'll also be warranties in there as well. So make sure you work with your surface manufacturer and your contractor to understand and know about your surface, because there will be some slight differences, and that could even be things to do with the footwear that's used. So look at that information and make sure that you are tailoring alongside the usage program, so that you are carrying out brushing after the right number of hours. It can be generic, but every surface is different. There are lots of manufacturers out there, and they're constantly developing and innovating. And the last thing you want is to find out you've got a problem 2 or 3 years down the line, and all of a sudden your warranty to be invalidated for whatever reason. So really read through your O&M manuals and understand what those warranties are.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Richard?
It's just a quick one. It's more around staffing. So if you've got an artificial pitch and you think, I'm going to brush it every day, that's not necessarily the best use of someone's time. So we've got a team of ground staff in-house, and initially with our original pitch, it was, right, we look after this every day, and we invested almost too much time in maintenance, and you take your staff away. So where we've worked closely and had that kind of blended approach with a contractor as well as in-house maintenance, we've taken the advice from the experts, and we're in a much better position for it. So in terms of a takeaway from today, if you're not already working with a contractor, I'd strongly advise you do.
Great, cheers. And then we've got one final question before we start to wrap up. So are there any methods that you're aware of other than water that that we can use to clean tarmac and polymeric surfaces?
It's a tricky one. It depends what you're cleaning. I mean, generally you'd use a sort of a high pressure cleaning system to do it, but you've got to be careful that you're not doing damage to the macadam, particularly if it's old macadam. You've got to be careful where that water is obviously disappearing to. So yeah, it's probably difficult to give a straight answer on that one, I'm afraid, without knowing a bit more detail.
Great.
There may well be some chemical treatments if there's things particularly like algae or things like that, but again, it's quite a specialist area, and you wouldn't necessarily be using that to clean the whole surface. It could be localized, areas where that might need to be used in conjunction with, the standard kind of water to remove standard contamination and debris. But again, it's probably something that you probably want to be speaking to a specialist contractor about if it's more than just standard debris and contamination removal.
That's exactly how we do it, Catherine. So at the end of the rugby season, our stand, we've got temporary seats on the running track. Those stands come up, and you have that issue with algae and various kind of food and footprints, etc., and dirt throughout the track. And we have a specialist that comes in with a piece of equipment, and it takes them around 5 days to clean the whole running track. So if it's a spot clean, you're not looking at a huge investment, but if you're cleaning a whole running track, the cost does escalate.
Great, thanks. We just had one final question come in around what training is available for those who are maintaining playing surfaces, and whether they should be considered mandatory as part of any funding that is received for, to put an artificial pitch in or surface in situ. So just thoughts on that from anybody?
So I guess from a football perspective and the foundation, you know, all the projects that we fund with the installation of 3G pitches, as part of the handover process, there is the O&M manuals, which contains maintenance guidance and information from the supplier and contractor, but they also carry out a training session with however many people from that facility, and they show them how to use the equipment, what is expected of them, and then periodically for the following 3 years, the supplier will then do biannual visits to go and speak with the facility operator, find out what's going on. So that's kind of where we're sat at the moment. I don't know, Tommy, if you want to mention, you know, potential course being developed by the GMA, but that's something that we will be adopting as the Football Foundation as something mandatory as part of our funding conditions. Great.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so that brings us on to the summary. So as Catherine just mentioned, we are currently developing the GMA's level 2 for 3G pitches. So for anybody on this webinar who wants to know a little bit more about maintaining their surfaces, and it is aimed very much at the operatives, so those that are out there on the ground carrying out the work. We're currently developing that and looking to launch that sometime in May, working very closely with the Football Foundation and other providers in terms of make sure that content is right, and then looking as part of any Football Foundation funded projects that all those that receive funding as a condition of their grant will have to do this course, just to make sure essentially that they are fully aware of what their requirements are going to be when it comes to having pitches in situ. So yeah, that's where we're at. So yeah, if anybody wants any more information, then you head to our website, which is the gma.org.uk, and drop us a line there. So before we kind of wrap up, are there any takeaway points that you three would like to summarise with for everybody on the webinar?
Yeah, I think from my side, I think it would a couple of things. One is that, you know, maintenance is really important. So please don't overlook it. You know, it's usually tied to the warranty of your facility, so it really is essential that you do it. And the other one, and Catherine mentioned it just then, was on footwear, particularly on 3G pitches, is absolutely critical. Things like flat-soled shoes are a big no-no because they do tend to wear the fibers down and flatten them much quicker. So yeah, maintenance is important. Footwear is important as well.
Great. Richard and Catherine?
Sorry, Catherine.
Just to reiterate Luke's point, you know, maintenance is key. If you're investing a large sum of money into a facility and you want it to last its expected lifespan, the only way you're going to achieve that is by looking after it really from day one.
And Tom, I touched on it previously. If you are going to look after it from day one, I would strongly advise that blended approach of working with a contractor as well as doing your bits and pieces in-house.
Superb. Thank you very much. That really just sort of leaves me to say huge thanks to everybody on the panel. So Richard, Catherine and Luke, also SIS Pitches, and for everybody who has tuned in tonight and listened, and hopefully you've found it valuable. I'm sure you agree there's been a huge wealth of expertise and lots of information has been provided over the course of the last hour or so. If anybody is keen to be involved in any future webinars, either as a speaker or as a sponsor, then please contact Luke Perry. That's lperry@thegma.org.uk. And yes, that's really it from us this evening. Again, many thanks for taking the time to attend the webinar tonight. Thanks again to the panel, and yeah, good night. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.